All right, welcome to Satsang this wonderful October 15th. In case anybody wants to know, it's the last filing day for extended individual returns today at the IRS. So I know that's a really noteworthy thing that everybody wants to know. So I thought I would drop that in. Um, Welcome to those that are here now. I suspect we'll have a few more walking in here. And today I wanted to, it's funny, I always start out with just a little bit of a um, commentary. And usually what that's from is what are the questions that have been being asked of me lately. And the one thing that I find really fascinating is that it seems like there's always a theme to questions. I don't know how that happens exactly. There's a synchronicity in our world, but sometimes it's about things like, is there such thing as free will? That was hot about a month ago. So lately what's been happening is that people have been asking me about the idea of non-duality and duality and consciousness and awareness, which those all go together. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes today and just talk a little bit about that. Those are the most intellectual kinds of questions, but they do have a real place that they live in everything. So if you start with just the idea that what is exists or what is available is pure awareness, and in the Upanishads, which is some of the oldest scriptures available, there's a commentary about how the spider spins its web and pulls it back again. So if you think of just pure awareness, but actually awareness with nothing to be aware of, that's what we call non-duality. And yet, what happens from that non-duality is the spinning of everything that we see. We call that manifestation, and we say that that lives in consciousness. Consciousness is the principle of everything that is in action. And then what we do is, because we have an intellect, we spin a story around what we see. So the spiritual journey is actually a function of becoming lost in what we call duality. What is duality? Duality is the extension of life into time and space. And so all of that activity in time and space. Why do we need time? Because we need duration to actually perceive. If you're going to create duality, that is a perceiving model, because you have one thing that perceives another. In order to have perception, guess what you need? You need time or duration, and that duration allows something to be seen. You also need space. If there's no space, there's nowhere for all of that perception to have whatever is rendered in front of it. So that's the magic of consciousness itself. It lives in duality. Awareness by itself is non-duality. It's just simply the perceiving. With, in essence, were there not the duality that arises, it would have nothing to see. So what is the function of consciousness? Here's a really neat thing to hold on to. The purpose of consciousness is to reveal itself to itself. That's what consciousness does. Now, because we have intellect, what happens is we create meaning, and we start to believe that things mean things. And in that meaning, we get lost in manifestation. So what is the spiritual journey? The spiritual journey is the activity of becoming unlost. So if you watch most spiritual pieces out there, you're going to see that what happens is they look out in manifestation and they say, oh, this means something. This meaning is spiritual. This is not so spiritual. And so when we start to do that, we're already lost. We basically are no longer moving back towards pure awareness, which is what we are. How does that happen? Well, as children, we come out and we're told that this is what life is. Life is this duality. and that this duality is where meaning lives, and in meaning we will find everything that there is to know and have about life. And so we build a world. We build a world in manifestation. And actually, the spiritual journey is adding the presence and the pure awareness of who we are to that. Because by paying attention to manifestation only and making it mean something and forgetting that we are awareness itself, we create a wall, and that wall walls us off from that. We spend an entire lifetime, in essence, looking in the wrong place. There's a really great old story. There's a fellow, Osho used to talk about this fellow. His name was Nasruddin, and he's famous beyond Osho. He's a Sufi saint. And Nasruddin, his claim to fame was that as a saint, he was the most naive and kind of obvious saint. So his stories are always really, really funny, because his wisdom was of a unique kind. And here's one of them. So being a Sufi and living back in the time of the bazaars and markets of the Islamic world, he was a main one of the main characters that was always attending the bazaar. And if everybody wants to know what a bazaar is, that's when everybody comes together and they have what today we would call a flea market, only these were big, grand things, and it was actually the lifeblood of the ancient world. So everybody would go to the bazaar. And so Nasruddin would, he loved to go to the bazaar. So he was well known, had lots of friends and everything. And one day he was at the bazaar, and he lost his key. He had a key and he lost his key. And so he got down on his hands and knees and he began to search for this particular key. And pretty soon, one friend after another friend after another friend joined him, and there were 10 or 20 of them on their hands and knees, in the bazaar, dirt and sawdust and little places to buy everything, as you know, how they're all organized. And so all of these people are down on their hands and knees and they're looking for a key. And finally, one of his close friends thought, I'm going to just check something here. He says, Nasruddin, he said, is this where you lost the key? And Nasruddin came up and he smiled and he says, no, I didn't lose the key at all here. He said, but the reason we're searching here is that the light is really, really good. And that's the story of how we relate to manifestation. We look out there and we see things. We're able to, because of our intellect and human faculties, pull things out and make them mean something. And then we convince ourselves that's where whatever searching we need to do needs to happen. And yet what's happened is what we've really done is we have disconnected ourselves from the source, which is really what we are. There's all those words, right? Source, pure awareness, and then consciousness is the next thing that actually makes all that manifestation happen, right? And all there is consciousness in our world, but it's our intellectual ability to make it mean something that convinces us that's where we need to go look. So actually the spiritual journey in its real form is a march back through the path that led us out into this manifestation forest where we believe that something needs to be found. And we actually believe that we are a autonomous author, just a story, right? Alan is just a story. Carolyn is just a story. James is such a story, just a story. Kara sitting in for Brad Cahill, just a story. Bottom line, that's what we are, is this beautiful, beautiful story held where stories live in our intellect. That's where they live. Stories are like the theme music, right? We see everything out there. Our intellect says, oh, we need theme music, and we'll put a story with that. And so theme music is the story of life, and it lives in manifestation. And yet, what are we looking for? Well, what we know intuitively is missing when we wall ourselves off from our source or from awareness itself is we're trying to basically reclaim that awareness or awaken to what it is that we are in pure awareness. And that's what the spiritual trek is. And that's what we all seek to do. So you can see in the world when we talk about, hey, I want to go save the world. I want to do something better for the world. Great idea. Obviously, this world that you see out there seems to need a lot of help. But here's the question: do you want to go save the world and lose the possibility of your spiritual journey in the process? So Nisargadatta was very famous for saying, and I always say this as well: if you basically awaken to yourself, you can then let consciousness figure out where you need to play on the playground of manifestation. That's not a decision you need to make. There's no reason to intellectually logic into a place that that you as an ego are needed out there, right? That usually is going to end. Well, it can end maybe well, because you spend a life thinking you're doing something that's meaningful, but you've given up the opportunity to actually be completely awakened and a whole being. And so that's the spiritual journey. So duality and non-duality. Actually, you're both, right? If you think about it, you're the awareness, that's the non-duality, and then you're the consciousness that arises from non-duality. Yesterday, I was sitting down at the beach and with a couple of friends of mine, and here in Hawaii, the old men that go and sit around in the coffee shop is replaced by old men who take chairs down to the beach and sit on the beach. So three of us were sitting down on the beach and having our Hawaii coffee clutch, and one of the three of us said, "Hey, listen, I've kind of figured out what life is. What it is it's this opportunity to go to a movie, and then you once you extract yourself from that movie, what's available is another movie. So all of the movies in manifestation are always available." And what happens, according to him, and he's absolutely right, I believe, is that after a while, all there is the noticing that there's lots of movies. And so after a while, you start to go, life as it exists seems to be a end-to-end possibility of seeing movies. And then it occurs to you, oh, who is watching the movie, right? Who's the observer of the movie? And that observing takes place from pure awareness, can take place from pure awareness. What happens is it always does take place from there, but then we interrupt it with a story where we claim that it's the ego seeing. So imagine that what you're seeing out here, you're perceiving, and also you can shut your eyes and perceive actually. But imagine that seeing is actually simply the seeing of consciousness itself. And your belief that it's you that's seeing something, that ego, is simply a hijacking of the absolute, or that's another word, by the way, for pure awareness, the absolute. So pure subjectivity, another word for that. You're going to hear all these words, and all they are is trying to say that awareness itself, which is what you are, is doing the perceiving, and that you and I and everyone else is exactly that same awareness. That's why it's non-duality. There's nothing but that possibility to perceive in pure awareness. That's all that sits there. And then consciousness explodes and delivers to pure awareness the opportunity to see all of those particular things. So that's actually, if you think about it, that's a story that I'm telling you, and I'm pointing to the experience that you're having and the reordering of that experience to a place where it is seeing that the awareness that you are isn't your ego. In that moment, awakening occurs. And a lot of us have moments of awakening. We call those free samples. So along the way, a lot of times there are moments where you go, oh, I see that I'm not really the observer, this Alan story, but actually it's something much bigger and much more powerful that happens in that scene. That's actually what's going on. And then a lot of times the ego will come back in and take it back over and say, oh, look what happened to me. Well, the reality is nothing happened to you. Nothing ever happens to you. You're just a story that you've created in your mind, placed it as theme music to the life that's going on there. And then that claim that is who I am is what happens. Now, what's misery? Misery is one really fun one in duality, if you think about it, because misery is the idea that you as an ego are going to call out what's going to happen. And then when consciousness actually acts and does what it does, those two things don't match. And Buddha would say, that's the source of all misery. It's the fight between the ego saying this is what needs to happen and what's actually happening in consciousness, which is what's going to happen. So one of the first things that one can do when they're dealing with duality in order to let the engagement with all that manifestation drop is to recognize that embracing what is and what arises is really a good way to close that gap. It eliminates misery for sure. So whoever gets elected president, that's how it is. Embrace it. That's what happened. Whatever, pick anything that you would like to, and you can simply embrace it for exactly what it is, because it is exactly what happened and what's going to happen. So that's been the topic lately. Now, then we talk about all the different pointers to have you experience those pieces that I just talked about. So when I sit around and I talk and I use pointers to point to something, I'm trying to point that beyond or before intellect is where you actually live and are. And when you point there, you're hoping that somebody will then have an experience, if you will. Now, is that your experience? No. If you make it your experience, you've egoized it again, right? So we're really good at that. So just be aware. We have automatic behavior and conditioning that makes us egoize a lot of things. But everything that lives in that egoized world of individuation and separation is all and basically an overlay on life itself. And life is happening by itself and really didn't need that help of ours that we've added to it. So why is the world in the same shape today that it was 4,000 years ago? Well, because consciousness is generating the world and we're overlaying our story, and pretty much the same thing is happening, only in different eras and different times. And really the liberation that's available is available at that point before you start to make everything about the individuals that are involved. I used to say, there was an old thing, they used to talk about, what would you take to a desert island? Books, whatever, you get 3 books to take to a desert island. And I remember making the comment that, there probably are only about 3 books that you need to take, because if you eliminate all the writing and everything that's ever been done about ego and just simply took the rest of what was left, that's probably about 3 books. Maybe it's 5, I don't know. But you could easily take everything you ever needed to a desert island if you ignored the fact that ego's in manifestation. If that was the subject, you can basically eliminate all of that you would like. So that's how duality and non-duality work. And so so if you're ever on a desert island, one of the ways to really cut down on your luggage is to get rid of everything that's been individuated, egoicized, or anything. Get rid of all of that writing and just take the stuff that comes from pure awareness. And as I say, there aren't a lot of books that you'll have to put in your suitcase. Funny thing, I don't know how many people actually plan to be stranded on a desert island, but hey, if you got to, I guess you'd know how to do it. I think most folks actually plan when they go somewhere not getting stuck on a desert island, but were that to happen, you're now officially prepared. All right, guys. Do I have any questions today? If I do, pop them down into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and actually come and talk to me, feel free. But that's the lead in and the intro to today's duality and non-duality discussion. What I've also found is that one of the things that you really want to do when you're talking about duality and non-duality is you want to have some very on the ground pieces that come right after that. One of the things that people do in spirituality, as you know, is they have a sense that speaking and discussing, that speaking and discussing is meaningful in some way. And so you need to say, hey, listen, that may not really amount to as much as I think that it will. So what does move one? What moves one is actually the resting in the, we call it the I am, and all the I am is your sense of existence. That's consciousness, your sense of existence, and under that sits pure awareness, or behind that, or however you want to say that. So from James to everyone, when you're writing a book, who's doing the writing? Well, no matter if you think everything that happens in existence, all of it is being exactly manifested by consciousness, and you aren't doing anything. Why do you think you're doing something? We've been taught to create a story that actually covers what that happening is, and then that gets held as though it were my act. Now, why does it feel so real? Think about that for a minute, and I'll tell you, because consciousness is this wonderful thing that's more than willing to play whatever game you want to play. So if the mind, which is also consciousness, is dedicated to assigning everything that happens to an individual, consciousness plays the game. So when you're writing a book, consciousness is doing the writing through you, and then it's also allowing that you attempt to own it as your story. And then you leave believing that you wrote a book. So here's a really good example. Everybody knows I wrote my book, and it's called Awakened Leadership. I wrote it in 2011. And I talked about writing that book for, I don't know, 5 years. I mean, people would ask me, and I'd say, yeah, I'm kind of working on a book. And what that meant was I was thinking I would write a book. Now, notice how I'm rendering that into I and Alan and everything. So the thinking of writing a book was happening in the mind of Alan, and actually in the mind of consciousness itself. And it wasn't that some things weren't discovered and the rest of it. But when it came to actually writing the book, I did all of the writing in that book. It's about 200 pages, 70,000 words. That happened in 8 weeks. When actually writing got placed on paper, that was an 8-week exercise. Then, of course, it was edited, and it took longer than 8 weeks to do the whole thing. But the actual writing of all the chapters were generated in about 8 weeks. Now, that's the way that consciousness evidently wanted to have that book rendered. And so there you go. Now, this time I'm working on a book, and I'm actually quite a ways into the book, but it's one that I started a couple of years ago, and I did a bunch of it, and then I went back to it and revisited and did a bunch of it. And I wrote on it a little bit a couple of months ago, and I haven't done much on it the last few weeks because other things have been happening. But I think that actually that book is going to arise at some point in time. It's close, but I don't know. I guess maybe in some point in time, the writing will start to happen again. So it's interesting, and in the way that it's experienced here, there's the knowing that it happens by itself. There's just an understanding, total relaxation. Writing didn't happen the last few weeks. That's good. Writing happened a little bit before that. That book is going to emerge when it emerges. And I trust that if there's a book that's going to emerge, it will. And if there's not, well, there's a whole bunch of writing that never will, but it's here on my computer somewhere. And that'll be the way it is, and totally relaxed about whether it happens or whether it doesn't happen. The egoicized need to actually complete, once that story is seen through, then there's simply a relaxation into what wants to arise, and a knowing that that arising happens through the body mind, and that that Alan is the story identity of this body mind, this one here, as opposed to the story identity of each of you. So really, if you take a look at all that we do around the story work that we do, a lot of that is helpful to take us back to where it is we lost ourselves. But if we didn't do that work, think about it, we wouldn't even need to worry about returning to that place, because that place would already be there. One of the things I find really interesting, just as kind of a side note, when you're talking about who's writing the book, when you're working with kids, and I started to work a lot more with kids than I used to, they know they're being conditioned away from something that they actually understand is their place. but in their sense of needing to move, they will abdicate that and actually move into the drama that we all call the human drama. But if you talk to somebody, one of those kids, they know that's happening. And if you actually support them to both develop what they need to develop in the egoicized world, it's totally great, but not let go of that beautiful piece that's already there. They recognize what that's about. So I'm working with a group in London called Sarva Education, which is the next generation education. And I think probably my contribution to that, and when I say mine, not mine, through me, is that recognition that, hey, we can teach in when conditioning is happening, that conditioning is happening, and not have it be this total abdication of movement into the ego only, leaving behind the consciousness and awareness that one is. And children are totally available to that. Isn't that funny? You can actually go back to where you were, and you probably don't remember that you even realized at the time that you were being conditioned away from something that actually was your very nature. Now as a kid, you wouldn't maybe have held that it was that important because everybody was moving away from it. So you figure, hey, that's the way that it's happening. And there was no support to stay there. But if you put some support to stay there, it would be interesting to see how that shifts what education actually is. The Dalai Lama is always talking about we need to recreate education. And I keep probing in what he says because I think this is what he's saying. He's talking about what I just spoke. Now he's a lot smarter and more elegant than I am and much more intellectual. So it might be that this brain doesn't have the ability to break that down, but I'm pretty sure that's where he's pointing, that education, were it to have that possibility, would render an entirely different exercise and moment in the movement of all of us in our spiritual journey. So something to think about. So is there sustained resting in the non-dual? That's a really great question. So yes, there's sustained resting. Non-duality is simply pure awareness, unaware of itself. Now that's funny. Why would I say unaware of itself? There's nothing to be aware of there. It's simply, in order to have awareness that is functioning, that functioning awareness has to have something to be aware of. Duality gives us that formula. So if you think about it, if something happens in front of me, the awareness, if you will, has the ability to track that. And it's only because there is a perception in duality. Duality, there's Alan here and some other object over there. In non-duality, there are no objects. It's pure awareness. And it has no need to be exercising the active principle of awareness, because the active principle of awareness only happens in duality. It's the only time it's needed. So when somebody, Nisargadatta, his famous comment was, my master told me to sit in the I am. And that's all I did. I quit focusing on anything out in manifestation, and I turned that awareness back on itself. And when I did that, that was when awakening occurred. And so that's the movement back into that non-duality that's always there. Pure awareness is always there. It's just simply from a recognition standpoint, mentally walled off because of the egoic story and the wall that we've put there as we've created that story. Pure consciousness here, pure output here, and a wall, in essence, in between, recognizing that neither the consciousness or the non-duality or pure awareness that sits behind it even exists. So that's walled off by the story that we create that doesn't include those two things. Think about it. Where else do you go that you ever hear anybody speak about pure awareness or pure subjectivity, if you will? Now, when you're talking about pure subjectivity, there's no objectivity in that commentary. It's kind of a funny way to talk about it, because you could call it pure objectivity as well, because there's only one thing to call it. There's not two. There's no duality in that particular setting. So yes, what we are is pure awareness, and what has happened is that pure awareness, the principle of resting possibility actually moves itself into action by consciousness emerging and duality being created at that emergence. And everything you see in manifestation and all of the cognizing, organizing, story creation, construction is all a function of what happens once consciousness is on the move. But when there is no consciousness on the move, all there is pure awareness, unaware of itself. And that would be the epitome of resting, one would say. And in fact, we refer to it as nothing, right? There's all of the nothingness is the aspect, because there's nothing to it. It doesn't live in consciousness where things are. So when you hear Nisargadatta or anybody or I say all there is consciousness, that's all there is consciousness. But pure awareness isn't. It neither is nor it isn't. It has no existence. It's the eternal possibility of awareness. When activated into duality, it actually is doing its awareness thing. When that's no longer happening, done. So when you die, what actually happens? Right? What actually happens? What actually happens is that you are in essence returned to pure awareness, because everything from the point of consciousness out passes. It's done. Consciousness is no longer active. The only way it can be active is to have a body mind, or some other sets of body minds, and or even the still pieces of stuff that are out there, right? Those are all attached to consciousness. So as a body mind, the body mind dies. Now, the one thing you really know, if you go up to a dead body, will you find consciousness in that dead body? No, because that's what makes it a dead body versus a live body, is the existence of consciousness that's operating in that body. Ramesh used to use the example of a can opener. I kind of like that one, because it really, if you were not feeling all that important earlier, I can really make you feel less important. We're going to pretend you're a can opener. And what happens is that you're what you are is pure electricity, right? That's his metaphor for pure awareness. And once you're born, you're a small can opener with the plug back into the wall, and all of that pure awareness is rolling through this can opener. And when the can opener gets old and it's no longer any good, you pull the plug out, throw the can opener in the trash. What makes a can opener useful versus not useful? The consciousness or electricity that flows through it, right? So when you die, you're no longer in consciousness. You're in pure awareness. That's all you are, this pure awareness, not manifested. And so you are, as Satyan is asked here, you're in sustained resting, because that's all there is in non-duality, is sustained resting. So I always say, I think one of the kind of coolest things to notice is, when I was 5 years old, there is a way in which the observing of life is exactly the same as the observing of life today. Even if I wanted to make it part of the Allen story, I would have to say that part of the Allen story is exactly the same then, in between, and now. There is a something, if you want, and I'm using probably the wrong word, but there is an essence, presence, perceiving that is exactly the same and is always the same. And that is the pure awareness. In other words, it always was. You were born plugged into the wall, and it got basically rendered into duality. And now you get to watch all of that. Now it's going to go away. And guess what? It's still going to be there, right? It's always there. And that's what we call the eternal principle. The knowing that you always were and the knowing that you always will be, by simply noticing that all of this stuff is happening to you. This body mind is 67 years old. And yet there's an exact sameness over 67 years of that observing, of that perceiving. Whose perceiving is it? It's the perceiving through Alan, the body mind, of all that is. It's always been there. It always will be there. It's the same perceiving that's happening through you. It's the same perceiving that's happening through my dogs. It's the same perceiving that's happening through everything, right? Even sentience, right? We have this thing called sentience where we go, some things are sentient, which means they're vibrantly alive, and some things aren't. Have you ever thought to yourself, well, wait a minute, the only way for me to divide the world into those two pieces is through the perception of a human body mind that says one thing's alive and one thing isn't? So who's to say that a rock isn't alive? I don't perceive that it's vibrantly living. Doesn't seem to be sucking air, sweating, doing any of those things. But that doesn't mean it's not alive or it's not in consciousness itself, right? So that's a way to kind of look at stuff and go, wait a minute, all there is consciousness. Consciousness is the entirety of manifestation as it's rendered in front of you. That's what it is in an exact way. So that question is a definite, absolute yes. I hope I explained it in a way that made a little bit of sense so that you guys could embrace it and hang on to it. So what are the pointers to that? Notice that in the pointers, what we're trying to always do is chink away at the assumption that you're an ego, right? So pick one. The need to feed. That's one of my favorites lately. And what the need to feed is the incessant need to argue with people over the truth of something. And where you will find that in its most pure form is on Facebook. The need to feed exists in its most pure form that I can find on Facebook. Because you can write blue and you will now have a 28,000 participant argument about just that one word blue. Happens on Facebook all the time. Wonderful thing to see. But what is that? That's the need to feed of the ego, because the ego needs to have a truth so that the ego can then locate itself in the world that it made up for it to locate itself. So fair enough. That's what that is. But when you see that there's no need, there's really absolute no reason to be engaged in truth. And in fact, we can say all there is your knowing that you exist, and everything from there on in is interpretation. So let's say you use that as a start. Well, arguing about the truth of something is an entire waste of time. But why do we use that as a pointer? Because that need to feed is the activity that continually confirms to you that your story that you are an ego and you are a you is true. So we live in this feedback loop, right? We do things that confirm that we are what we dreamed up that we are. So we live as if it were true, and we go out looking for any kind of a factoid that we can then put in our story and confirm that that's what's going on. That's what human life is. The ongoing confirmation that we are what we dreamed ourselves up to be. That's what manifesting life is. So what we do is we start to crack that. We go, wait a minute, this need to feed, is there really a need to feed? Does that really exist that way? And you go, oh, well, maybe it doesn't. And the minute you say maybe it doesn't, it's a chink in the story. So this whole path that we're talking about non-duality and pure awareness and all the rest of it, how do you get there? By actually chinking away at this sense that you are an autonomous author of your own life, or that the ego itself is a real thing. Now, it's a perfect thing for operating in life. In other words, the ego will never be destroyed. It just needs to be seen as a fictional construct that allows egoic life to happen. So when Satyan goes, hey, Alan, then the Alan body mind goes, what do you need? Right? That's egoic operation. But what drops away is the belief that Alan and Satyan are actually story identities. There's a knowing that, hey, Satyan, hey, Alan is simply that communication that's happening among two stories that are simply fictionally constructed so that this talking could happen. What's really happening? It's the same question that James has. Who's writing the book? This speaking right now is simply consciousness speaking to who? Consciousness. Your consciousness, I'm consciousness. The blathering of the Alan story is happening in a thing called satsang. People are sitting around going, when we go to satsang, there is a possibility of dissolving that leads us to a deeper sense of what is. And as we move into that deeper sense of what is, then we look back and we see the blathering of the story identities and we go, oh, I used to think that was Alan talking to Satyan, and what's really going on is consciousness is speaking to itself. And that's exactly what's going on. That's what life is in its purest stripped down form. Those are actually pretty cool back-to-back questions, by the way. Who's doing the writing, and is there a sustained resting in the non-dual? Because those are easy to describe. So how does one arrive there? Pointers, right? Because there is no truth. So trying to teach you something that lives in duality and in the intellect, that's not helping. It's pointing outside of the intellect and saying, hey, the construction that you think you are, that's the questioning. That's the self-inquiry. Self-inquiry is actually inquiring as to whether the self that we think we are is actually the self we think we are. That's what it is. Who am I? Am I the story identity that I made up, or is there some deeper version of that I? That's exactly what self-inquiry is. And you'll hear that term a lot as well. Awesome. All right. Any other questions? I thought that was fun. I enjoyed those two. A lot of what I'm doing lately, it's funny, Ramesh used to do this a lot, and I'm sure that the need was created, as I say, by this sort of sense of things. But my noticing is that in the world of awakening and non-duality, in the area that we're talking about, that it gets incredibly intellectual. In fact, I had a friend one time tell me, he says, I don't like that Advaita thing, because you go over there and it's kind of really dead and lifeless, and just, it's very in the mind. And I thought, that was a pondering, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. And then I recognized that what it was it did attract that element. And what was really apparent is that we all come in as this huge, energetic, beautiful moment and possibility of exploring and embracing life. And where does that come from? Well, it depends on how the body mind is constructed and what it's available to do. James has this curiosity that, just rambles on all the time. But that curiosity is life itself, right? So it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So that placed in me this sense of things that if you can't take the discussion of non-duality and awareness and consciousness and drop it onto the ground and make it live in some real and rooted way, that what's happening is you're leaning into this kind of dead intellectual place. The conversation about awakening becomes another intellectual conversation that's devoid of color and life and vibrancy. And that really that's not really what's out there. So there's no problem with embracing how life is. It lands on the ground, basically boil it down and take advantage of every moment, squeeze it like a lemon. That's the awesome thing to do. But how's that happening? Recognize that the squeezing of the lemon is being lived through you by consciousness. That's all. It's just that difference in what it is that one thinks that they are. And that recognition opens up an entire world. It creates a permanent peace internally. There's no such thing as feeling like anything needs to be sought for or found. And it turns life into a perfect arising in every moment. It allows for all sorts of different things to occur because there's no longer an enslavement to the story that's been created. If you watch most egos, they are enslaved to the story that they've created. And that's easy. That's very, very easy to see. All right. Any other questions in the room? If you do, pop one in there for me and I will finish off with that. This has been a really kind of a fun one. It's been a short, but really intense one. And the couple of questions that I got were really, really well positioned. But once again, remember, how does it live in every moment? Ramesh was always about that. How does it live in every moment? I never understood why he leaned so hard into that. And now, as I do this work, I start to see that the escape is into the intellect and into the mind. And it's where we always escape. And that unless you can make this live on the ground, that in a certain way, the connection never gets completely created. All right. There are no more questions. Well, we're going to have a short one today, guys. I think I've said everything that I need to say. Just as a FYI, I talked about Sarva education. You're going to start to see a little bit about that. I've been asked to participate in that. And so it's an opportunity to actually create some educational curriculum, both for the corporate leadership world and for the next generation of children, that includes the element of consciousness and awareness as an ongoing teaching, along with all of the manifestational stuff that we normally teach. So when you see Sarva education, note I'll be working over there. My spiritual MBA, along with other corporate pieces that have been long taught at the large brands, will also be generated through Sarva education. So that'll be a lot of fun. But I'm really excited about being able to do that. So just my personal fun news. That's what the Allen story gets to do, is to get to go play with a bunch of kids and executives. Imagine this though. I have an 11-year-old boy who wants to create a story workshop with me. Think of where you live as a child, right? That pure essence. And so he and I are going to create a story workshop, and I'm going to put that in my executive acumen program as an addition to what's already there, so that when we have executives from the largest brands in the world that come and actually do workshops and the curriculum I'm creating, part of it is going to be a story workshop that's taught by a 67-year-old man and an 11-year-old boy. And will that give them the opportunity, these corporate people, the opportunity to connect to that particular place in them that they lost long ago? And I think being taught by a child, you might be led back to that place for yourself and see the birthright and the power of that particular place that always was there and that we thought we needed to move away from. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So when you see Sarva education, that's what it is. I love you all. I'll see you the next time. 2 weeks from today, we'll be doing it again. Thanks everybody who came in. Really a wonderful thing. Bring your questions next time. And I will see you then. Bye.